I bet a lot of you watching this are probably pretty fully saturated with the Blessing 3 versus Blessing 2 videos, and I for one am just about ready for some other comparisons with the Blessing 3. I myself recently wrote an obligatory Moondrop Blessing 3 versus Blessing 2 review, but I won't lie, the matchup I was actually itching for was the Blessing 3 versus Final Audio's A5000. The A5000 is a recent enough release that offers a lot of the qualities that rocketed Moondrop's Blessings into popularity, but has curiously not garnered the same attention that I for one think it deserves. The Final Audio A5000 is on the market for $279, while the Blessing 3 comes in at $319, perhaps a moderate price difference for some, but I'll more or less treat them as equals in a common tier for this review. I'll be going over their fit, physical and technical design, what they sound like relative to one another, but first, let's see what comes in their boxes. With the Final Audio A5000, you get a soft silicone carrying case, your Final Audio A5000 IEMs with a detachable 2-pin cable with a 3.5mm unbalanced jack, 5 pairs of silicone ear tips and this ear tip holder, and optional detachable ear hooks. And with the Moondrop Blessing 3, you get a sturdy zipper carrying case, the Moondrop Blessing 3 IEMs with a 2-pin cable with a 3.5mm unbalanced jack, and 6 pairs of silicone ear tips. And I'll make this quick, but I just want to thank Audio46 for giving me these review units of the Blessing 3 and the Final Audio A5000. If you're thinking about purchasing either one of these, you can help support the channel by purchasing them through the links in the description from the Audio46 online store, and I would be very, very grateful for that. But anyway, starting with fit. The Final Audio A5000 and Moondrop Blessing 3 both offer exceptional comfort, but take opposite approaches. The Blessing 3 is unapologetic when it comes to its chunky build that visibly bulges from a listener's ears. I take no issue with its size, however, as the thoughtfully smoothed over physical design prevents it from straining or agitating any part of my concha or ear canals. I'm also feeling forgiving towards the chonk, considering the 6 drivers contained on each side, but more on that shortly. Also, just a quick note, the nozzle is now thinner than it was on the Blessing 2, which makes things a little more comfortable. The A5000, on the other hand, finds its ergonomic comfort in its smaller design. The chamber side of the IEM is mostly flat and rests flush up against a listener's concha. While it has a more angular character to it than the Moondrop Blessing 3, the edges on the corners of the housing round out at key points that make light contact with a listener's outer ear. I find both IEMs to contain a high level of comfort and don't really have an outright preference. Perhaps the simple and succinct consideration to be had in this department is the Final Audio A5000's snug qualities versus the more casual and relaxed fit of the Moondrop Blessing 3. In terms of style and aesthetic, we see some pretty major differences once again. The Blessing 3 is the flashiest iteration of the Moondrop Blessing yet, with its cutesy, pixelated Moondrop Blessing 3 font sitting on its glossy machine steel faceplate. We also see the transparent medical-grade resin featured in plenty of other Moondrop designs composing the housing, leaving the internal workings of the IEM entirely visible. There are a lot of textures competing with one another in this design, but I find it to be a pretty coherent blend. I do want to note that this new glossy faceplate makes the Moondrop Blessing 3 pretty susceptible to smudging and scratches, to be honest. But while the Moondrop Blessing 3 is sporting a fun and spunky outfit, the Final Audio A5000 is the type of IEM that only wears black turtlenecks. Its housing is opaque and composed of ABS resin with a special Shibo finish like the A3000 and A4000. It's angular, minimalist, distinctly modern, and takes itself a bit more seriously than the Blessing 3. Aesthetically, at least. Now, moving on to technical design. So, the biggest technical enhancement that we see in the Moondrop Blessing 3 from its previous generation is the inclusion of a new dynamic driver, in addition to the 1 dynamic driver and 4 balanced armature drivers that went into the Blessing 2. To date, I can't recall trying an IEM at this price point with 2 dynamic drivers, which makes the Blessing 3 a pretty impressive oddball. Its dual dynamic drivers were arranged in a system that Moondrop has catchily dubbed HODUS, horizontally opposed dual dynamic driver unit system, which symmetrically places these dual dynamic drivers in close proximity to one another and implements various 3D printed hardware filters to regulate issues with phase and resonance in their interplay. With the A5000, there's a little less to go over. We see a single 10mm dynamic driver with Final Audio's proprietary F-Core DO design principle. F-Core DO is a pretty cool design. I won't be getting into it in this video. F-Core DO is featured in a lot of Final Audio designs, but you can look it up yourself. And F-Core DO basically just serves to reduce distortion to a near zero level. So while there are some more technicals to go over with Moondrop's Blessing 3, a more complex design doesn't inherently mean a better design. And as I'll detail, the competition is pretty stiff between these two IEMs. Now, let's get into what they sound like, starting with a comparison in soundstage and imaging. Both the final A5000 and the Moondrop Blessing 3 perform exceptionally well for their price points when it comes to their spatial character. The Blessing 3 finds a pretty significant width that's distinctly felt on hard pans. And while it clearly pushes more depth into its stage than the Blessing 2 and manages even, a modest holographic character, parts mostly stay pretty close to the face, if not quite on the face. It also possesses a pretty satisfying internal 3D quality that places parts inside of my head rather than around it. So while the Blessing 3 is solid and a couple of degrees above average when it comes to staging and imaging, I think the A5000 is simply fantastic in its spatial layering and could well be considered soundstage royalty in the market tier that we're dealing with here. Height, width, and depth are all abundantly present, and parts are positioned as if they reside on finely plotted points on a 3D grid. Vocals perch dead center above the forehead, while instruments find a deep and wide expanse, sometimes managing to push themselves behind the head. Both units really do have a lot to offer here, and though soundstage may be one of the more subjective features of a given IEM or headphone, I can't help but think that most people would agree there's something particularly special about the A5000's accurate and expansive stage. In my opinion, the Blessing 3 is outdone here, but for that matter, so is nearly every IEM in this price range when comparing it to the A5000. Now, getting into balance and starting with the low end. The Blessing 3 sees a new low-end tuning from its sophomore predecessor, with high bass amplitudes getting redistributed to its subs and mid-bass. As it so happens, this brings its low-end closer in line with the A5000 than what we heard with the Blessing 2. So when it comes strictly to talking about balance, we can categorize the bass response on the Blessing 3 and A5000 pretty similarly. One, not overly eager to color a mix, but powerfully jumping into action on moments of low-end impact like kick drums or deep bass notes, stuff like that. And two, creating a very clean separation between the mid-range and the low end. But there's a distinct difference in the textures that go beyond balance when we're talking about this low end. The A5000 is really firm and fast in its lows, and showcases a really high level of detail in its subs and mid-bass. To my ears, it's a much more analytical and faster sort of signature. And while the Blessing 3 doesn't suffer from slow or floaty bass, and in fact even delivers some pretty respectable slam, it's a little more resonant in its delivery of lower frequencies, and I don't mean that as a bad thing. It leaves time for some kind of warm and tasteful blending, where the A5000 commands its low end like a tyrant. And now for mid-range. While I more or less gave the last two rounds on soundstage and low end to the A5000, the Blessing 3 finds a victory in the mid-range. The A5000 has a moderate V-shaped balance, which is really only noticeably exposed in parts that heavily rely on center-mid frequencies, logically enough. Really, there are only two occasional mid-range casualties: vocals and snare drums. At times, they lack forceful delivery and are positioned just a little too quietly in a mix. But if there's one balance aspect that Moondrop's Blessings consistently get right, it's their mostly neutral and natural sounding mid-ranges. And the Blessing 3 might be the most natural Blessing mid-range to date. Vocals, snare drums, guitars, any mid-range part that commonly composes the backbone of a mix sit with a classy and highly intelligible realism. Though I admit I'm nitpicking a bit at Final Audio's A5000's mid-range, as I do still enjoy it after all, this is simply a testament to how tight the competition really is between these two IEMs. It's ultimately finer details like these that are going to set them apart from one another. And now finally for the higher frequency balance. The A5000 and Blessing 3 both have really solid performances in their treble, and I don't have much to criticize here for either. However, once again, we hear two different approaches. The Blessing 3 finds just the slightest amount of extra brightness compared to the Blessing 2, but nonetheless has a much more Harman-like treble character than what's heard in the A5000. It mostly serves to preserve realistic high-frequency detail, with just a little colored brightness in its mid-treble that pulls some higher harmonics out of electric guitars or strings, for example. The A5000's treble, on the other hand, goes a long way in delivering the IEM's distinct and unique balance qualities. Sure, it has those tight and commanding subs and mid-bass, but the A5000 leaves me with a primary impression of airiness. Its treble seems to be significantly amplified and pretty well extended, but virtually avoids any trace of becoming harsh, peaky, or shrill. Instead of leaving me with a tonal impression, I hear its bold treble as imparting a fine and smooth timbre that lifts the entire balance and creates a delicately lightweight contrast from its deep and fast low end. The A5000, more than anything, is a really airy sort of IEM. So for a quick summary and reflection of everything that I just said, let me be honest by putting my biases up front. On a strictly subjective level, I connect with the Final Audio A5000 in a very particular and personal way. So if you were to ask me, sure, my preferences lie with Final Audio's A5000, in the sense that I like it more than many IEMs that are multiples of its price. But that said, when I approach this with a more objective lens, I come to a kind of different conclusion, which is that the Blessing 3 and Final Audio A5000 are very worthy peers that serve to make the $250 to $350 range of IEMs one of the most valuable price pockets in the broader IEM market. If you want a firm, gripping sort of IEM with a powerful and analytical low end and a colorful treble profile, Final Audio's A5000 is there for you. If your values are more in line with a warmer and more emotive low end with a clean and natural mid-range presentation, the Blessing 3 is probably the better choice. Either way, this was a really great review to do. Much respect to both companies for making such high-quality IEMs at reasonably attainable price points, and I really don't think you can go wrong with either unit, and I'm not just saying that. I'm leaving links to purchase the Final Audio A5000 and Moondrop Blessing 3 from the Audio 46 online store. If you purchase them through the links in the description, you will also help support the channel, for which I will be very, very grateful. If you want to see more video reviews like this, feel free to like and subscribe down below. Anyway, this is Chris with Major Hi-Fi, and I'll see you guys next time.